Good morning to one and all. My name is Mayank Baranwal, roll number 1701010084, and this is my BTP Phase 1 presentation under the guidance of Dr. Ashish Anand on using path-based hierarchical loss functions for relation classification. So today we'll first give a brief introduction on relation classification and its role in NLP. Then we'll look at hierarchical loss functions, specifically path-based measures and their potential applications in relation classification. Then we'll do a very brief survey in relation classification, the different techniques that have been used, and finally go on towards the problem statement and the proposed direction of research. So we start off by introducing the information extraction pipeline, which is critical to discern structure or meaning from an unstructured text. We'll go through the pipeline with an example on the side. So the first step is entity recognition, which involves locating entities in a particular corpus. This can be done with coarse-grained or fine-grained entity. In the example, we see it's identifying Lisa and Mike. Then we look at entity linking, which is establishing a subject-object relationship, and this would be the subject-object relationship in Lisa and between Lisa and Mike here. Finally, we look to classify the relationships, possibly on a hierarchy. In this case, we see Mike and Lisa are related together as a spouse. So the current problems we face with relation classification is that there's a lack of training data. Distance supervision-based data is too noisy, whereas manually annotated data misses out on a lot of relevant patterns. Furthermore, we notice that the models are not tailored to relation classification. Entity-based models tend to focus on a single entity, whereas relations are a relationship between two different entities, and so equal weightage must be given to both. And finally, loss functions don't reflect the hierarchy. The same penalty is given for classifying a parent-child relationship as a sibling-sibling relationship or a city-country relationship, even though sibling-sibling is much closer. And so there's a need for the cost function to reflect the relational hierarchy at hand. So we'll now look at some of hierarchical loss functions and their applications in NLP. We start with a review of semantic similarity measures, some basic terminology. Given two nodes Ci and Cj in a relational taxonomy, the length is the shortest path between them. LSO represents the lowest common ancestor. Depth is how deep the particular node is. Depth max is the maximum depth. And sim CICJ is the target similarity. So the shortest path measure directly takes up length CICJ and subtracts it from 2 into depth max. Wu and Palmer's measure tries to improve upon this by realizing that two nodes which are the same length apart, deeper in a hierarchy, are much closely related together. And so they do this by using depth in the numerator and denominator and accounting for the depth of these particular nodes. Leacock and Chodoro's measure provides a balance between the two while also taking the logarithm that allows for a reflection of the depth. Now we'll see how these measures are incorporated into hierarchical loss functions. We begin with neural fine-grained entity type classification with hierarchical aware loss. In this, there are three parts. There's a standard bidirectional LSTM. There's an LSTM encoder that takes one word before and after for a mention, and there's also an average encoder that averages out all the mentions, and all of these are fed into a feature representation that determines the relation. The main contribution of this particular paper is how they handle overly specific labels. Overly specific labels are those where a model goes ahead and labels an entity with a label that cannot be discerned from the context. And so what this paper does is it penalizes a particular model for being too specific in nature. And thus a model will only go ahead and remove and identify this particular entity as a very specific label if it's very sure. However, we note that this is more of an optimization and not directly incorporating the hierarchical loss function. And the authors also note that in training, the model seemed to be too conservative or too liberal at certain points. The model also handles out of context labels, which we do not discuss in the interest of time. We now look at a paper which fully incorporates the hierarchical loss function. Here, the hierarchical loss and its problems while classifying non-hierarchically defines an ultrametric distance tree, wherein the distance from the root node to the leaves is all equal. This is done by assigning at each depth d the weight 2 power minus d, with exception to the leaf node, which is assigned the previous node's weight. So now we see that the path from a root to the base is 1 half plus 1 by 4 plus 1 by 8 plus 1 by 8. So the hierarchical win here is defined as the sum of the path from the root to the lowest common ancestor between the target and the guess node. So in this particular case, if a Sipner was the lowest common ancestor, the hierarchical win is half plus 1 by 4 plus 1 by 8. But now we note that the probability distribution has become discrete in nature. And so we may need to adjust gradient descent methodology for it to work in this particular context. So we now come to relation extraction. Having looked at hierarchical loss functions, we will now look at existing literature in relation extraction and see how we can incorporate the relation hierarchy not only through a cost function, but also perhaps directly incorporating it into the model architecture. So the first paper we'll discuss is position aware attention and supervised data improves slot filling. This paper is revolutionary because it gives equal weightage to both entities, the subject and the object. Furthermore, it identifies positional vectors PIS and PIO, which provide spatial information between the word and the entity. This is important because now we have information regarding the distance between from both the subject and the object. Furthermore, they also use a summary vector that provides semantic information about the whole word. So they obtain the hidden layer values from the standard LSTM, but then they provide weights for taking in both the positional indexes as well as the summary vectors, and finally apply softmax to determine the final relation classification. This is a very important part because they have given equal weightage to both the entities. They also contributed the TACRET dataset, a new dataset which had a unique factor that a large number of the examples in it had no relations. Up until now, datasets had focused only on identifying what type of relation is there, but not no relation. And as a result, in a lot of cases, relations would be identified between entities even though they didn't exist. And this is something that this particular paper has tackled. Also, the sentences they have put forth are much longer, and so a sample sentence is included here with the potential options. So we see that this data set is much more extensive and allows the model to even pick out more convoluted relations that could exist. We now look at hierarchical relation extraction with coarse to fine-grained attention. This paper goes ahead and directly integrates the relation hierarchy into the model for training. So we see that different layers of the relation hierarchy are fed into make up different layers of the model network. And so this is important because now we have information about the relation that is being extracted from a coarse to a fine-grained level as we move deeper down the network. So the way this works is input entity pairs H and T are fed in bags with examples where the two are related or not related, and the word embedding piecewise convolutional neural network that we see here calculates an effective score alpha I of the mapping. Furthermore, they go ahead and use hierarchical selective attention with a two-layer hierarchy to define the relation closeness between the two entity pairs. So we see sentences being represented, and then they're fed to this hierarchical selective attention through RHT. This paper is one of the few that uses hierarchical relation the hierarchy directly, but it's important to note that it's not using path-based measures, which is the area of our focus. Finally, we move to the problem statement and the proposed direction of research. So the main problem statement is, given a relational hierarchy, we need to define a hierarchical loss function that uses path-based measures to classify a relation from a corpus. Just to restate, a path-based measure here would be identifying two nodes, that is Ci and Cj, the model guess and the model target, and defining a distance metric between these two nodes. We are not looking at the overall relational hierarchy, we are focused more on what these two nodes are and how their relationship is. So the proposed direction we can look towards is, first we need to have a relation hierarchy. For this, we plan to use Wikidata or Parekh et al.'s taxonomy. Then we need to have a cost function. We could go ahead and expand the ultrameric construction that was detailed in this particular paper. We note that something we can expand upon is that here in this particular paper they stop at the lowest common ancestor. But if we had nodes that were deeper from these particular nodes, then the hierarchical win in both cases would be the same, even though two nodes that are deeper and less related to one another should be penalized to a greater degree. So incorporating that could be something we could look towards when defining our hierarchical cost function. Now, the last point is we need to have a model. For this, we can try and incorporate the relation hierarchy into the model architecture, if possible, like we discussed in this particular paper. So that is all from my side. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.